Edit 11 days. That was the entire timeline. Just 11 days after the United States naval blockade went into effect, the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran appeared on national television and asked the population to reduce food consumption. He did not frame the request as an act of revolutionary unity. He did not present it as a tribute to fallen fighters. He did not connect it to decades of rhetoric about Western imperialism, Zionist aggression, or any of the narratives the government has used for 47 years to justify sacrifice. Instead, he asked citizens to eat less because food supplies were becoming scarce. He urged households to reduce electricity use because the power system was under strain. He posed a question on state television, with cameras broadcasting across the country and around the world. What is wrong with turning on 2 lights at home instead of 10? A government that spent 47 years telling its people that no adversary could break them. A government that endured sanctions, assassinations, and the 12-day war with Israel. A government that justified every hardship, every deprivation, and every execution as the necessary cost of confronting the great Satan, was now asking citizens to conserve power by switching off most of their lights only 11 days after a blockade began. At the same time, somewhere inside secure command facilities, IRGC leaders who designed the strategy of closing the Strait of Hormuz, launching 5 waves of missiles against the UAE, striking Qatari gas facilities, and mining international shipping routes, were left facing a question that apparently had not been addressed during planning. If Iran blockaded the strait, what would prevent the United States from blockading Iranian ports? The answer was now visible to the entire nation. A televised appeal asking people to eat less food only 11 days after maritime restrictions began. While Trump sent a message to a journalist who had spent 2 weeks in Islamabad waiting for what was expected to become a historic agreement, informing them that negotiations were over and they could return home, the possibility emerged that the conflict might begin again. And as that possibility grew, Iran was asking citizens to turn off 8 of every 10 lights in their homes. To understand why 11 days produced a presidential appeal for food conservation, it is necessary to examine the aspect of the blockade that received far less attention. The critical issue was not only preventing Iranian oil exports, it was also stopping imports. Food, medicine, electronics, and weapons were no longer reaching Iranian ports. Before the conflict, between 40% and 60% of Iran's food supply came from imports. The decision by the IRGC to use civilian cargo vessels as platforms for transporting weapons created another consequence. It erased the distinction between civilian and military cargo in the logic used to enforce the blockade. As of May 21, 2026, the United States naval blockade, fully enforced since April 13th, was functioning in 2 directions simultaneously. It blocked Iranian oil exports from leaving port facilities. It also prevented incoming cargo from entering Iranian harbors. The vessel MV Tuska became a key example. When the ship refused compliance during enforcement operations, the United States Navy fired on its engine room and seized it. The ship was not carrying Iranian crude for export. It was traveling toward Iran. Its cargo included weapons components originating in Southeast Asia and China, together with items listed on a civilian manifest. The seizure demonstrated that the blockade applied equally to incoming shipments. It also showed that the use of civilian cargo ships for weapons transport had removed any practical distinction between civilian resupply and military resupply. Before the war, Iran imported approximately $60 billion in goods annually through its seaports. That equaled roughly $160 million worth of incoming cargo every day. Between 40% and 60% of the nation's food supply came from abroad. Among the most important imports were staple grains, wheat, maize, rice, the basic calories supporting a population of 92 million people. Imports also included oils, seeds, and additional grain products that formed the foundation of everyday nutrition. These were not luxury products. They were necessities consumed daily by ordinary people, regardless of politics, leadership, or military doctrine. The blockade halted approximately $160 million of inbound cargo each day. A substantial portion of that total consisted of food. Only 11 days after those flows were interrupted, the Iranian president appeared on television asking people to reduce consumption. The explanation becomes clearer when examining inflation. The crisis did not begin with the blockade. The blockade pushed an existing problem into a far more severe phase. Before the conflict, food prices in Iran were already increasing at roughly 10% per month. Not 10% annually, 10% every month. The mathematics of that trend produced a specific result. At 10% monthly inflation, prices approximately doubled every 7 months. For households to maintain the same purchasing power, wages would also need to rise by 10% every month. No sector of the economy was providing wage growth at that pace. No business could sustain monthly cost increases of 10% indefinitely without facing closure. As a result, the gap between earnings and food prices widened continuously. Each month, a larger share of household income was consumed by basic necessities. Then the war introduced another shock. Imports were disrupted. When food shipments stopped arriving, supply was removed from a market already experiencing rapid inflation. Supply had already been struggling to meet demand. The interruption made conditions worse. Price growth did not slow, it accelerated. Economic models evaluating a prolonged blockade scenario projected monthly inflation rates reaching 20% or more if the conflict resumed. Some forecasts identified annual food price increases of 500% as a plausible outcome under the current trajectory. That projection emerged in a country where food costs had already been doubling approximately every 7 months before the blockade. Now consider the situation in Tehran. The crisis there provides insight into the governing system that is currently asking citizens to consume less food and use less electricity. Tehran is home to more than 10 million people. Iranian officials have warned through state media and statements provided to international organizations that the city could become uninhabitable if current trends continue. Not in a distant future, soon. The primary cause is not simply drought, although rainfall levels have been inadequate. The deeper issue involves decades of infrastructure mismanagement. Dam construction altered the hydrological systems feeding Tehran's aquifers. Illegal wells extracted groundwater faster than nature could replenish it. Agricultural practices consumed water at levels far beyond sustainable requirements. The same governing culture that managed water resources to the point where the capital of a country as large as Iran may eventually require evacuation is now managing the response to a naval blockade. Following the 12-day war with Israel, the Iranian supreme leader announced that any future conflict would involve economic warfare against Gulf states. The strategy included closing the Strait of Hormuz, attacking Gulf energy infrastructure, and disrupting commercial shipping. The policy was deliberate. It was publicly declared. Yet during the planning process, one question appears not to have received sufficient attention. If Iran closed the strait and targeted maritime commerce, what would stop the United States from applying the same pressure against Iran's own ports? Answering that question required understanding that between 40% and 60% of Iran's food came from imports. It required recognizing that 92 million people still need food every day. It required acknowledging that a naval blockade imposed in response to a closure of the strait would represent the most obvious countermeasure available in a maritime confrontation. The same institution that brought Tehran's water system to the edge of crisis failed to account for that possibility. Now that institution is appearing on national television and asking citizens to switch off 8 of their 10 lights. Now consider the IRGC's decision to turn civilian cargo vessels into platforms for weapons transport, because this was the operational choice that transformed the blockade into a comprehensive restriction on imports, rather than a limited one. Understanding why that decision was made reveals the priorities driving the institution's actions. The Tuska was registered as a civilian cargo ship. Its paperwork listed civilian goods. Its movement through the region appeared consistent with ordinary commercial traffic moving along the trade routes of the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Oman. Yet hidden within that cargo were weapons components intended for rebuilding Iran's ballistic missile program. Those materials originated in China and moved through Southeast Asian intermediaries before being concealed among civilian shipments. This reflected the IRGC's shadow logistics network applied to a specific challenge. Operation Epic Fury's focus on launcher targets had reduced missile launch capability to 14% of its previous rate. The IRGC requires weapons to preserve itself as an institution. Its identity, its justification for consuming between 30% and 40% of Iran's economy. Its claim that it serves as the essential guardian of the revolution. All of that depends upon demonstrating military power. Missiles remain the most visible and strategically important symbol of that capability. With launcher capacity severely reduced, rebuilding the missile program became a priority. That process required components. Those components had to enter the country through routes capable of bypassing sanctions. Civilian cargo ships became the chosen route. Food, medicine, electronics. These items listed on shipping manifests provided concealment. The American response to this behavior followed a straightforward logic. If civilian cargo vessels are being used to transport weapons, and if a ship has already been caught doing exactly that, then distinguishing legitimate cargo from military cargo requires inspections. Every vessel approaching an Iranian port must be checked. Every incoming ship becomes a possible Tuska. Each inspection creates delays. Those delays affect food deliveries, they affect medicine, they affect civilian goods contained within the same cargo loads. The IRGC's decision did more than lead to the seizure of a single vessel. It ensured that import enforcement would be carried out broadly enough to treat every incoming ship as a potential security threat. Once the IRGC demonstrated that any vessel could function as a smuggling platform, every vessel became subject to suspicion. In the most direct chain of cause and effect, the resulting food shortage emerged from that decision. Civilian shipping was used to preserve institutional military capacity. The blockade then applied the same logic in response. The outcome was a food crisis. And meanwhile, the Iranian president appeared on television urging citizens to consume less. Now consider Islamabad and what Trump's cancellation of the Pakistan trip revealed about the state of negotiations. The details strongly suggested that the next stage of the confrontation would be military rather than diplomatic. In the period leading up to the cancellation, Islamabad offered the clearest public indication of how seriously both sides viewed the possibility of a broad agreement. Pakistani authorities placed the capital under extraordinary security measures. Businesses closed, roads were restricted, security forces were visible throughout the city. Barriers surrounded access points leading toward diplomatic districts. Reports continued to circulate, supported by credible intelligence, that the upcoming talks might become important enough for Trump himself to attend. Security preparations reflected that possibility. For roughly 2 weeks, Islamabad operated as if it were preparing to host the diplomatic event of the decade. The reason was simple. A comprehensive Iran-United States nuclear agreement negotiated in Islamabad would have represented the most significant diplomatic breakthrough since the JCPOA a decade earlier. But unlike the JCPOA, these talks existed within an environment shaped by military enforcement. Pakistan's role as mediator carried unusual credibility. Throughout the conflict, it maintained communication with both Washington and Tehran. At the same time, it deployed 13,000 troops to Saudi Arabia under a mutual defense agreement. That combination gave the Islamabad framework legitimacy that no alternative venue could easily match. The preparations were genuine. The opportunity appeared genuine as well. Then, Iran's foreign minister departed Islamabad after discussions with Pakistani mediators. According to Pakistani sources, those meetings focused on restarting negotiations with the United States. They also included a specific Iranian position. Iran would not accept American red lines, but remained willing to participate in what it described as rational and fair negotiations. That wording carried obvious implications. Iran arrived seeking renewed negotiations while simultaneously rejecting the conditions defining the purpose of those negotiations. The American position regarding nuclear concessions, enrichment pauses, surrender of uranium stockpiles, and inspection access was not a matter of style or presentation. Those conditions formed the foundation of any agreement. Without them, the central issue that the blockade was designed to address remained unresolved. Arriving in Islamabad while declaring those conditions unacceptable amounted to arriving without intent to negotiate them. Trump's response reflected that assessment. He stated that he had informed his team, who were preparing to leave, that the trip would not happen. He said they would not undertake an 18-hour flight. He stated that the United States held all the cards. He said Iran could call whenever it wished, but there would be no more 18-hour journeys simply to sit and discuss nothing. The trip involved approximately 3 hours of flight time to Pakistan and back. Combined travel time totaled 36 hours. The outcome was an Iranian position that rejected American red lines, while remaining open to terms that Iran itself would define as rational and fair. The cancellation did not resemble a negotiating tactic intended to increase pressure. Evidence pointed elsewhere. Islamabad returned to normal operations. Shops reopened. Security barriers were removed. Traffic resumed. Trump sent a message to a journalist who had waited in Islamabad for 2 weeks and told them they could return home. Those developments suggested the negotiating phase had ended rather than entered a new pressure campaign. When journalists are told to go home, the diplomatic moment is over. Something else follows. Attention then shifted to another aspect of Trump's statement. The language he used regarding Iran's leadership offered insight into how American intelligence viewed the country's decision-making structure. He stated that enormous infighting and confusion existed within the Iranian leadership. He added that nobody knew who was in charge, including Iranians themselves. The statement was presented publicly, but it reflected an intelligence assessment. American intelligence agencies had been tracking what they viewed as the IRGC's institutional takeover of authority from the civilian government. They had observed Vahidi's declaration that the IRGC controlled all critical positions. They had monitored Peskian's inability to contact the supreme leader. They had watched Iraqi's diplomatic initiatives being publicly contradicted by IRGC-aligned state media. They had seen Galibaf forced from the negotiating team after attempting to include nuclear concessions. They had followed discussions involving Saeed Jalili, who spent 6 years ensuring nuclear negotiations never produced an agreement. The assessment presented to Trump was straightforward. There appeared to be no unified authority within Iran capable of approving the concessions necessary for a deal and then enforcing compliance against institutional resistance from the organization, controlling both the nuclear program and the military assets that would need to be restricted or dismantled. Sending Wickoff and Kushner on an 18-hour journey to negotiate with a foreign minister who lacked authority over the core decisions was not viewed as meaningful diplomacy. It was viewed as costly theater. Trump's cancellation reflected that judgment. Nobody knows who is in charge. The United States holds all the cards. Iran can make the call. Making the call is the commitment. An institution that sends its foreign minister to Islamabad while rejecting American red lines is not signaling readiness to make that commitment. Until that changes, the blockade remains in place. Now consider what renewed military operations would mean for the food and electricity crisis already exposed by the president's televised appeal. Iranian economists, modeling the next 6 months, describe a trajectory that extends far beyond the current call for conservation. Food inflation had already reached 10% per month before the blockade. The blockade then imposed an additional shock by cutting between 40% and 60% of the food supply entering the market. If military operations resume, even the limited commercial activity that continued during the ceasefire period would face further disruption. Under those conditions, inflation would accelerate again. Iranian economists examining the outlook under renewed conflict are projecting monthly inflation rates reaching 20% or more. Compounded over a year, that points toward 500% annual inflation. This is occurring in a country where the exchange rate already stands at 32 million rials for one United States dollar. 500% inflation in a nation where food prices had already been doubling approximately every 7 months before the war began. In a nation where between 40% and 60% of food supplies came from imports. In a nation where those imports are no longer arriving because of the blockade. And in a nation whose president recently appeared on television asking citizens to consume less food and switch off 8 of their 10 lights. That appeal represents day 11 of the crisis. Day 25 would look different. Day 40 would bring another reality entirely. The timeline identified by the CIA as the threshold for internal fracture, approximately 3 to 4 months after the blockade began, is now converging with the timeline of the food supply crisis itself. According to that assessment, economic pressure reaches a point where loyalty breakdowns begin affecting the IRGC's own payment system, a pattern that historically precedes institutional collapse. Events already unfolding after only 11 days of comprehensive import interdiction are making the July and August estimates appear increasingly conservative. A presidential request for reduced food consumption emerged after less than 2 weeks. Now consider the irony. The IRGC created this situation without fully accounting for the most obvious response available to its opponent. The history of the water crisis suggested this pattern. The food crisis is now reinforcing it on a much larger scale. Following the 12-day war with Israel in the previous year, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei approved a strategic framework designed for a future conflict scenario. The framework included closing the Strait of Hormuz. It included an economic pressure campaign against Gulf states. It included activation of proxy networks as the primary instruments for influencing American decision-making. The plan originated within the IRGC's strategic planning structure. It was reviewed by senior elements of Iran's security establishment. It received approval from the Supreme Leader. Yet throughout that process, involving many of Iran's highest-ranking military and intelligence officials, along with their analytical staffs, there appears to have been no successful modeling of the response now being carried out by the United States. Iran's strategy centered on restricting access to a maritime corridor. The response centered on restricting access to Iranian ports. The logic is symmetrical. If Iran can prevent vessels from using the strait, then a naval power with sufficient capability can prevent vessels from reaching Iranian ports. This is not an obscure strategic concept. It is the most immediate implication of the strategy itself. The failure was not an inability to predict a sophisticated American reaction. The failure was not anticipating a mirror image application of the same tool. The organization that failed to foresee that closing a strait could lead to a blockade of its own ports is the same organization that permitted so many illegal wells to be drilled, that Tehran now faces the prospect of becoming uninhabitable. The pattern is consistent. The governance failure appears across multiple areas. The water crisis, the food crisis, the strategic planning breakdown, all emerge from the same institutional characteristic. The IRGC's economic empire consumed resources that could have supported strategic food reserves. Its planners concentrated on offensive capabilities while giving insufficient attention to defensive vulnerabilities. Its focus on preserving institutional resources created a system that struggled to prioritize civilian resilience, because resilience competed with internal resource accumulation. And now, only 11 days after a blockade whose most obvious countermeasure was apparently overlooked, the Iranian president is asking citizens to help sustain the regime by reducing food consumption. Now consider the operational meaning behind Trump's statement that the United States holds all the cards. That assessment helps explain why canceling the Pakistan trip was presented as a position of strength rather than a retreat from negotiations. According to that view, the advantages available to the United States are numerous and concrete. 3 carrier strike groups are operating in the theater, representing the largest naval concentration in 23 years. The blockade is reportedly functioning at 100% effectiveness. 39 ships have been turned away. The MV Tuska has been seized. CENTCOM confirmed SEAD operations eliminated Iranian SAM batteries that attempted to engage American aircraft. 7 IRGC fast attack boats now rest on the seabed. Mine-laying vessels were destroyed before their mines could be deployed. Iranian missile launch capacity has reportedly been degraded by 86% compared with day one attack levels. 90% of Iranian trade has stopped. $500 million per day is reportedly being drained from the regime. Storage facilities are nearing maximum capacity. Oil wells are approaching forced shutdown conditions. Deployment planning for the Dark Eagle hypersonic missile is underway. 4,000 Marines remain aboard amphibious assault ships carrying F-35Bs. Pakistan has 13,000 troops and fighter aircraft positioned at Dam. The UAE has publicly stated that direct involvement cannot be ruled out. The Gulf Coalition includes Turkish Korkut systems, Hisar layered defenses, and Akinya UAVs integrated with Alter munitions. The CIA assessment indicates that the regime's internal fracture point may arrive during July and August. The food crisis is already visible after 11 days. The presidential request for electricity conservation has already occurred. There may be another appeal on day 25, another on day 40. And by day 60, disruptions to food distribution could reach a point where requests for conservation evolve into requirements for rationing. From this perspective, the side holding all the cards does not send negotiators on 18-hour flights to meet a foreign minister who has already rejected the central conditions under discussion. It waits, it remains at the table, and it allows the other side's options to diminish over time. Food reserves decline. Electrical infrastructure struggles as imports of fuel and components become more difficult. Reliability of payments to IRGC personnel deteriorates as oil revenue remains at zero. The leverage that the IRGC believed it possessed, control of the Strait, proxy networks, support from China and Russia, and expectations of Gulf neutrality, has already been tested against the combination of the American naval blockade, Allied air defense systems, and direct military participation from Gulf states. Now bring every element into a single picture. That is what makes May 21st, 2026 such a significant operational moment. 11 days of import interdiction have already produced a televised appeal from the president, urging people to eat less and use fewer lights. Islamabad is reopening after 2 weeks of security restrictions that had been imposed in preparation for a diplomatic meeting of historic importance. That meeting will not occur. Trump informed a journalist that it was time to return home. Negotiations have ended. The food and electricity crisis inside Iran continues to accelerate at the pace expected when a nation dependent on 40% to 60%. Imported food loses access to those imports. Food inflation that stood at 10% per month before the war is now moving toward the 20% or greater monthly rate projected by economists under blockade conditions. If conflict resumes, projections point toward the 500% annual scenario. 3 carrier strike groups remain deployed. Dark Eagle planning continues. Marine forces are in position. Turkey issued what was described as the Gulf's final warning after Iran launched ballistic missiles at a conference where Turkey had been attempting to preserve diplomatic engagement on Iran's behalf. Saudi Arabia is expelling Iranian embassy personnel and citing violations of the China-brokered peace agreement. Preparations in Islamabad are being dismantled. And somewhere in Tehran, inside the planning rooms of the institution that closed the Strait of Hormuz without fully accounting for the most obvious response, inside bunkers where handwritten messages are delivered by motorcycle to a leader recovering from 3 leg surgeries and governing through committee structures. A question is now being answered in real time. It is the question that was apparently never asked during the original planning process. What happens when the other side responds after we close the strait? The answer is the blockade. That answer has already produced a national television appeal urging people to eat less. 47 years of assurances that no enemy could break the country now confront 11 days of comprehensive import interdiction. The evidence emerging from those 11 days suggests that the claim was always closer to aspiration than certainty. Most Iranian homes still have electricity. The president did not ask for 10 lights. He asked for 2. And with every additional day that the blockade remains in place, with negotiations suspended, and with the food import deficit moving deeper through a supply chain on which 40% to 60% of Iranian caloric consumption depends, the request for 2 lights risks becoming a request for 1, then perhaps something less. Trump says the United States holds all the cards Iran can call. The phone remains waiting. Meanwhile, citizens are being asked to eat less. And the IRGC's planners are left confronting the reality that this crisis emerged without a full examination of the one question capable of changing everything. What would the opposing side do after the strait was closed? The blockade is the answer. And on May 21st, 2026, that blockade is 11 days old. If you found this analysis valuable, follow for more in-depth military, geopolitical, and strategic content examining the events shaping global affairs. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.